Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Chemical Watch Events and Training by Enhesa. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Harry Watts. I'm going to be chairing today's webinar. I head up partnerships for the Product Intelligence division here at Enhesa, like the one we have with REACHLaw, who are going to be speaking today. Before handing over to them, I'll give a quick introduction to who we are and run through some housekeeping notices. In case you didn't already know, Chemical Watch has undergone some big changes over the past year. The biggest one is that we're now officially Enhesa Product Intelligence. So we're very happy to be sharing the new look and feel of the brand with you all. Having first joined Enhesa in 2020, we're now very excited to have taken the next step in our evolution. We have combined the Chemical Watch offering with Enhesa to create a complete regulatory and sustainability intelligence solution for leading global organizations. This solution spans the specialized areas of product intelligence, the part that Chemical Watch specialized in, EHS intelligence, so facilities and people, as well as sustainable chemistry. This change includes moving our home to the Enhesa website and renaming the Chemical Watch offering to Enhesa Product Intelligence. So we'll continue to evolve the mission of Chemical Watch to help product safety and compliance professionals avoid the risk of non-compliance and to help them achieve market access. We'll do this by continuing to provide regulatory data, news, analysis, events, training and expert support. To find out more information, you can visit our website at enhesa.com/product-intelligence. Where you can also request a presentation and platform demo. So before we get started, I just want to mention that you can raise questions during the webinar by using the questions box, and we'll endeavour to respond to as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end. Please also use this box if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, and we'll do our best to resolve those issues as well. Delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Alessia Winterberg works as the Global Accounts Lead and Legal Advisor at our partner, REACHLaw. She's been working at REACHLaw since 2010 and has extensive experience in REACH-like regulations and their effects on a wide range of industries, and provides regulatory advice to clients all around the world on those issues. So, Alessia, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you very much for your time today, and thanks for sharing your expertise and experience with us. And finally, please note the recording will be sent to you by email over the next week, and please keep an eye out for the feedback survey that you'll receive by email later today. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to you, Alessia.
Thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Alessia Winterberg, and today I'm going to present to you Ukraine REACH topic, and we will discuss in much detail about the implications of Ukraine REACH for your role in the supply chain. Next slide, please. So Harry has already presented me, but just for your information, I have worked with many chemicals regulations, and at the moment my focus is heavily on Ukraine REACH and related chemicals regulations in Ukraine. So the agenda for today, I will briefly introduce REACHLaw for those who doesn't know us. Then I will introduce and explain about the changes in the chemical safety legislation in Ukraine. Then we will talk about the industry implications based on your role in the supply chain. And afterwards, we will actually discuss each key implication for your role. So it will be Ukraine REACH registration, data sharing, and simplified registration, permit for toxic chemicals, and permit for the chemicals on the authorization list, restriction applications, and safety data sheets. And then we'll conclude the session. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A session. Next slide, please. So I will introduce REACHLaw. So REACHLaw is a chemical compliance consultancy firm. We have our headquarters in Helsinki, Finland, and this is where I'm located. We have offices also in Brussels, Belgium, in Manchester, UK, in New Delhi, India, in Istanbul, Turkey, and in Seoul, South Korea. And recently we have established an office in Kyiv, Ukraine. Next slide, please. We provide a wide range of services under the chemicals regulations that you can see on the right side of this slide. So EU REACH, UK REACH, Korea REACH and KOSHA, Turkey KKDK, Ukraine REACH, India BIS and REACH when it enters into force, and other chemicals regulations. And our support ranges from the only representative services and registration services to legal and technical consultancy services. Next slide, please. For Ukraine REACH, we provide a full range of services, not only for Ukraine REACH per se, but also Ukraine CLP and other related legislation in Ukraine. So if you need an only representative, we are happy to provide the service to you through our newly established office in Kyiv, Ukraine. We provide registration services, Ukraine CLP related services, and wide range of consultancy services. So in case you have any specific questions related to your company that you cannot post here due to the confidentiality implications, please feel free to contact me. Next slide, please. And as agreed with Enhesa, we will publish this recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel. So in case you are interested to subscribe, please subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Next slide, please. And just a few disclaimers before we go further. So if you go to the previous slide, please. So disclaimer on the previous slide is that the information prepared by REACHLaw for this presentation is based on the information currently available to us. And before you act on this information, please consult with legal professionals and verify if this is applicable to your specific case. Also, we do reserve all the rights to this information. And this is the IPR of REACHLaw. And next disclaimer, please. So just for your information, the information on this presentation, again, is based on a very new regulation. So some parts of this information is very speculative, therefore there might be changes later on when we proceed further with these regulations. Therefore, just keep this in mind. So this was the last disclaimer and we can move further. Next slide, please. So now we will have a look at the chemicals legislative framework in Ukraine. So the big change in the chemicals legislative framework in Ukraine happened when on the 1st of December 2022, a Ukrainian parliament has approved the law of Ukraine on ensuring chemical safety and management of chemical products. We refer to this law as Law on Chemical Safety, or briefly LCS. And this law entered into force on 29th of June 2024. It had 18 months of transitional period. So from approval to the enactment, it was 18 months. This is a so-called horizontal law for the chemical safety in Ukraine. And because of this law, basically Ukraine CLP and Ukraine REACH have been also approved later on. So Ukraine CLP, this is not the topic for today, but still relevant. Ukraine CLP has been approved on the 10th of May 2024, and it enters into force actually tomorrow. So stay tuned for our newsletter on the matter. And the Ukraine REACH was approved a bit later, so after LCS has been implemented on the 23rd of July 2024, and it enters into force on the 26th of January 2025. So Ukraine CLP and Ukraine REACH are not laws per se, they are technical regulations, so they are under the Ukraine law on chemical safety. And the technical regulations, they normally have the 6 months from the approval to enactment, so a transitional period of 6 months is pretty standard for such regulations. Next slide, please. So the competent authority for the chemical safety in Ukraine is Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine, abbreviated as MEPR. And we will often refer to this competent authority as the Ministry of Environment for simplification purposes. So you can visit their website on the link on this slide, and you can find quite a lot of useful information, although in Ukrainian mostly. Next slide, please. So if we go to the topic of today, Ukraine REACH, again, I will repeat myself, this is an important piece of news. So on 26th of January 2025, Ukraine REACH officially enters into force. At the moment, there are no indications for any postponement. This is a horizontal chemicals regulation. It's a massive chemicals regulations in the same way as it is in the EU. So it has 673 pages. It's a lot of requirements for the chemical industry, places a huge burden on the industry. But good news is that it's very similar to EU REACH, and if you know EU REACH, you most of the time you know also Ukraine REACH. So I'm gonna just tell you that because we received many questions about this, whether there is an English version of the regulation, official English version. No, there's only Ukrainian version, and likely there won't be any official English version of this regulation. Next slide, please. So Ukraine REACH has adopted also the annexes from the EU REACH. So all 17 annexes from EU REACH were transposed into the Ukrainian REACH. And we also have additional annex in Annex 18 that contains the correspondence table. And this is not in the EU REACH. Next slide, please. So you can see on this slide the correspondence table in the Annex 18, which provides an overview of comparison of EU REACH articles and Ukraine REACH provisions. On the left side, you see the articles from the EU REACH, and on the right side, provisions from the Ukraine REACH. And as you can see, the annexes of the EU REACH and Ukraine REACH just correspond to each other, and only this Annex 18 of the correspondence table is different in terms of annexes under these two regulations. So this is very useful piece of information, and even if you don't speak Ukrainian, you could use it very efficiently. So if you want to check specific article of Ukraine REACH and how it is made in the Ukraine, I mean in comparison to the EU REACH, you can cross-check this using this useful Annex 18, although in Ukrainian, but still useful. Next slide, please. So let's look at the differences between these two regulations, so Ukraine REACH and EU REACH. Of course, because this is Ukraine REACH is the Ukrainian regulation, there definitely would be different contextual and terminology adjustments. For example, Ukraine doesn't have the European Economic Area. It doesn't have such a terminology as community or member states or ECA for that matter. So all of these have been removed from the Ukraine REACH text and substituted with applicable words and processes relevant for the Ukrainian specific governance structure. We have unique provisions in Ukraine REACH. These are provisions on toxic substances. This is a separate category under Ukraine REACH, and also law on chemical safety. And we will look at this during this presentation in more detail. And we have also provisions on simplified registration mechanism for chemicals and companies registered under the EU REACH. And again, we will talk about this in more detail later on in this presentation. So all in all, Ukraine REACH basically is almost a copy of the EU REACH with specific modifications to reflect specific regulatory environment in Ukraine and the differences in Ukrainian governance. But at the same time, the essence and the framework of the EU REACH has been preserved. Next slide, please. Important information on EU REACH, Ukraine REACH transitional period. So there is 12 months transitional period for Ukraine REACH obligations for chemical products that were on the market before the enactment of Ukraine REACH. So in simple words, if you have been placing your chemical products on Ukrainian market before 26th of January 2025, you have 12 months transitional period for the requirements of the Ukraine REACH to apply to your company and your chemical products. Next slide, please. So now let's look into the industry implications based on the role. So the general requirements for the industry would be that all substances at 1 ton or more, unless specifically exempted, are in scope of Ukraine REACH regulation, and they must be pre-registered and registered by all Ukrainian manufacturers, importers, and only representatives representing non-Ukrainian manufacturers and formulators. In addition to registration and registration, the other processes under Ukraine REACH in the same way as they are under the EU REACH, such as evaluation, authorization, restriction, apply under the Ukraine REACH. And we have the no data, no market article that has been transcended into the Ukraine REACH in the Article 17. So you need to either generate or acquire data from the data owners to be able to, for example, register your chemical substance. Next slide, please. In terms of scope of the substances, basically all substances, unless specifically exempted, are in scope of Ukraine REACH regulation, because as we have spoken before, this is a horizontal chemicals regulation applicable to most of the chemicals, basically to all unless exempted specifically. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the key responsibilities for Ukrainian actors based on your supply chain. So we have defined Ukrainian manufacturer, Ukrainian importer, and Ukrainian only representative representing either non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator. So all of these three actors, they have an obligation for the pre-registration, and we will talk in detail about this. All of them have to register their chemical substances, and data and cost sharing principles apply also in Ukraine REACH in the same way as they do in the EU REACH. And there is an obligation to keep the registration dossier up to date in the same way as it is currently under the EU REACH. If you're a manufacturer or importer placing toxic chemicals on Ukrainian market, you need to get a permit for these chemicals. Whether only representative can apply for the permit on behalf of non-Ukrainian manufacturer formulator is yet to be determined, because if we read the law, it seems that it have such right, but from the practical point of view, this is for now questionable and has to be determined by the competent authority. If you are placing substances on the market, if you want to place substances on the market that are on the authorization list in the Annex 14, you need to obtain a permit. This is also related to law on chemical safety for most of the requirements. However, this is the requirement for manufacturers, importers, and only representatives. Restrictions apply to all of these three actors in the same way, so Annex 17, and safety data sheets are required from manufacturer and importer. For only representative, this is optional, the same interpretation as it is under the EU REACH. And we have the obligation of the record keeping. However, the only representative has a bit more of the record keeping to do. So there is a requirement for volume tracking on amounts and customers sold to in the same way as it is under the EU REACH. Next slide, please. So most of the companies probably on this present now at this webinar are likely non-Ukrainian manufacturers or formulators. So you're interested how you could comply. So for you, we think that you have basically 4 options. For the option 1 is if you have a subsidiary in Ukraine, so you can either appoint it as your only representative, or it can act as an importer for your chemicals. So this is option 1. Option 2, and the recommended one, is that as a non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator, you can appoint a professional only representative that can professionally take care of your compliance matters. Option 3 would be a combination of the option 1 and option 2. For example, your subsidiary, if you have one in Ukraine, could act as an importer for certain substances, and the professional only representative would act as an only representative for you for other substances. And then there is option 4, although not much recommended. You can do nothing and leave your compliance to your customers in Ukraine. But as we know from the experience from other REACH-like regulations, this is not the most efficient way to tackle the compliance issues under REACH-like regulations. Next slide, please. So here you can see the articles from the Ukraine REACH related to the only representative of the foreign manufacturer. So basically, they are almost the same. This is a non-official translation, so please read it with caution. However, it's clear that the only representative under Ukraine REACH, in the same way as it was required under the EU REACH, must have sufficient knowledge and practical experience in handling chemical substances. Therefore, choose wisely. Next slide, please. So now that we have discussed about the implications based on the role, let's look at those implications one by one. And the first one is the pre-registration. And in fact, the pre-registration implication and the requirement has to be a focus for the chemical industry at the moment, because this is the one that is coming into force quite soon. So we are now in the transitional period for the Ukraine REACH. So we are currently about 2 months away from the enactment of Ukraine REACH. And when Ukraine REACH enters into force on the 26th of January 2025, this is when the pre-registration period starts. So you have 1 year transitional period to submit your pre-registrations, and the deadline for pre-registration submission is the 26th of January 2026. You're able to submit the late registrations for chemicals placed on the market for the first time. This is also a possibility in Ukraine. But this is only for the first time manufacture or import substances. So please don't miss the opportunity to register your substances under Ukraine REACH, because this is a prerequisite to benefit from the transitional registration deadlines. So even though we are now at the pre-registration phase, but in this timeline, we will look also on the registration deadlines. So once pre-registration is done, the first registration deadline currently under Ukraine REACH is the 1st of October 2026, and this is for substances at 1,000 ton or more per year, CMR substances, and very toxic to aquatic organisms. So in the same way as it was for the first registration deadline under the EU REACH. The next one would be on the 1st of June 2028 for 100 to 1,000, and afterwards on the 1st of March 2030 for 1 to 10 and 10 to 100 substances. And these are actually the registration deadlines that were not in the initial draft. So the initial draft, they were much closer to the pre-registration deadlines. So this is actually the better registration deadlines that the competent authority has provided. However, as you can see, the first registration deadline, the 1st of October 2026, is very close to the pre-registration deadline. Therefore, for substances that have to be registered according to the first registration deadline, have to start the registration preparation work immediately after the pre-registration has been completed, and preferably not after the pre-registration deadline, but much earlier. So at least halfway through the pre-registration deadline, it's better to start the preparatory work for such substances. Next slide, please. So basically, all substances that are in scope of Ukraine REACH registration have to be pre-registered if they are placed on the Ukrainian market. And you have 1 year to do so, as we discussed earlier, and the deadline for submission is 26th of January 2026, so 1 year from the entry into force of the regulation. And as we already discussed, the late registration is possible for existing chemicals placed on the market for the first time after the Ukraine REACH entered into force. Next slide, please. The registration requirements are similar to what we had back in the days in the EU REACH, except for the substance identity information. As you can see here in the requirement number 1, there's quite much more information that Ukraine REACH registration requires. So we would need to provide the impurities, additives, and etc., etc. However, it's yet to be determined whether this is really a mandatory information or optional one, because we haven't yet seen any templates for submission of the pre-registration. So hopefully this extra information will be optional one, but yet to be determined. Then you need to provide the identity of the submitter, and in case of foreign manufacturer, also the details of the foreign manufacturer, expected registration deadline, and annual production. It's written as exact, but we think it would be actually the tonnage band, again, to be determined, and then a statement that the applicant has access to information on the chemical substance necessary for applying QSAR and read-across provisions. We believe this is a requirement currently stated in the Ukraine REACH regulation, but it looks like it will be optional as it was back in the days under the EU REACH. Next slide, please. So just to conclude the Ukraine REACH pre-registration, you have a 1-year transitional period. So please don't miss that opportunity, because this is how you can benefit from the transitional registration deadlines. So the pre-registration preparation and submission. So first you have to compile the information. And if you could click through this slide, please. So you compile your information in accordance with the requirements of the Ukraine REACH, and then likely the submission will be done through the Excel file. There will be an Excel template for submission of the pre-registration information, and then you will submit it to a dedicated email address. And then after 30 days from the pre-registration deadline, the Ukrainian competent authority, Ministry of Environment, has to publish the pre-registration registered substances and their pre-registration numbers on their website or somewhere a dedicated website, like an inventory. Whether the names of the submitters would be published, this is yet to be determined, likely no, due to their confidentiality implications, but has to be still confirmed. Next slide, please. So essentially, the inventory of existing chemicals will be published as a result of the pre-registration. So 30 days after the pre-registration deadline. So it means on the 26th of February 2026, we will have our inventory. We should have our inventory of existing chemicals ready. Next slide, please. This was the pre-registration. Now let's look at the registration, data sharing, and simplified registration requirements. So here on the slide, you can see the process from pre-registration to registration. So let's quickly go through this. So if you manufacture a substance in 1 ton or more and it's not exempt from registration, you have to pre-register it. You submit your pre-registration by the 26th of January 2026, and this is how you enter the pre-CIF, and this is your pre-registration process. Then from this pre-registration process, you go into the registration process, so you have to agree on the substance sameness. A lead registrant has to be nominated, and you have to agree in the CIF on many different things, sign the joint registration cooperation or CIF agreement, and then you register as part of the joint submission by the applicable deadline. Next slide, please. So there is a requirement of the joint submission in Ukraine REACH in the same way as it is required under the EU REACH. And you could have, so basically there is a lead registrant. If you click on this slide twice, please. So you have a lead registrant. It's only one lead registrant. It's a requirement. And then you have 0 to as many as there are co-registrant in this in the joint submission. Next slide, please. So as you can see, there is a requirement of joint submission, and you have to submit the data jointly, but to submit the data, you need to have the rights to submit the data. And it is expected that the data will be probably the most expensive component from the registration under the Ukraine REACH. And you will need to secure the rights to the data from the data owner, whether it will be a lead registrant in Ukraine, if he has the rights to data or has the right to sublicense this data to you, or whether you will have to go to the data owner, for example, in the EU, sign the data agreement with the data owner in the EU, and then joint registration agreement with the lead registrant in Ukraine is yet to be determined. But as we could conclude from our experience from Turkey KKDK, the data access negotiations and the process is not that straightforward. It's pretty complex and normally takes a lot of time from all the actors relevant for the applicable chemicals regulation. Next slide, please. So this was a normal FMA regular registration that we had discussed previously. However, under Ukraine REACH, we have provisions in the articles 26 and 27 related to the simplified registration. And it was a great idea for companies and substances registered under the EU REACH to be eligible for a simplified registration if they are placing on the market the same substances in Ukraine. Next slide, please. However, if you look at the requirements for the simplified registration, what we have here, so we have a technical dossier in UCLID format, so you have to submit the dossier. You have to submit the chemical safety report, if applicable, and you have to submit a confirmation of the EU REACH registration, likely a decision letter from ECHA or something similar. It's not determined in the regulation text as such. So quite a lot of requirements for simplified registration. If you go further, please. So even though the idea for the simplified registration is great, however, there are quite many questions on the applicability of the simplified registration. So how can you refer to the data that you have used for the EU REACH purposes, submitting the same data for Ukraine REACH? Normally, you cannot do this because if you read your CIF or joint registration agreement for the EU REACH that you have signed when registered the substance there, normally it doesn't allow you to use the data anywhere for any other purposes than the EU REACH registration. So in fact, even for simplified registration, you will need to secure the rights to refer to the data. It's relevant for both the CSR and for the registration dossier as such. Then we have a problem with the EU importers. So how EU importers would benefit from the simplified registration? If they register the substance in EU and the same substance will be registered, but by who? By completely other legal entities. So it's unclear how the EU importers can benefit from the simplified registration. Likely they cannot. Then we have a problem of a lead registration. So if the lead registration submits the simplified registration, so how does he become the lead registrant and what about the data sharing? And in the same way, it applies for the co-registrants. What if the co-registrants apply for the simplified registration? If they are eligible for it, of course, then what happens next? How are they added to the joint submission, and the implications for future data sharing are a big question mark. So as you can see, there are quite many questions on the applicability of the simplified registration. And if you go to next slide, please. So all of these concerns and even more have been raised with the competent authority during the public consultation during spring 2024. And the authority is aware of the problems related to the simplified registration. So likely there will be a certain guidance or clarification from the authorities in the near future, hopefully rather sooner than later. So we would know how to prepare for the simplified or not simplified, the regular registration. So In any case, the simplification in terms of the fee reduction will likely stay, because if you're eligible for a simplified registration, your registration authority fee is lower. So at least this is a good benefit. So you could save some money for the authority fee. However, whether there will be in fact simplification in terms of data submission, it is yet to be determined, and in what form. So the authority is aware of this, and we just have to wait and hope that we will get the clarification when Ukraine Reach enters into force. Next slide, please. So now, as we have discussed the pre-registration, registration, data sharing, and simplified registration, let's look at the permit for the toxic chemicals. And this is probably very interesting for most of the companies present at this webinar, because this is something very different and unique in Ukraine Reach. So Ukraine Reach Article 259 defines categories of substances that are classified as toxic. So toxic substances under Ukraine Reach are those that have acute toxicity category 1, 2, and 3, specific target organ toxicity single exposure, specific target organ toxicity repeated exposure. And the classification is done according to Ukraine CLP. So if you are manufacturing or placing on the market these substances, you need to have a permit. And a permit is applied to, again, from the Ministry of Environment, and the requirements for the permit are specified in the law on chemical safety. And this is what I was talking about in terms of interconnection between the Ukraine Reach and law on chemical safety. So many things that are relevant and requirements that are relevant under Ukraine Reach are also specified in law on chemical safety, and then they become much clearer to you if you read both Ukraine Reach and law on chemical safety. So the requirements for the permit are in the Article 49.9 of the law on chemical safety, not in the Ukraine Reach. And the competent authority has 30 days to review, to grant or reject the permit for the toxic chemical for you. And the permit duration would be 3 years. Next slide, please. So basically, if you're manufacturing or using toxic chemical substances, you need to apply for a permit for each of the toxic substance and for each specified use. So it's not only per substance, but also per use. So basically, legal entities are not allowed to manufacture or place on the market the chemicals that are classified as toxic without having the permit for this specific chemical and the specific use that they use it for, or manufacture. Manufacture is also a use in this case. But here we have a problem. So the requirement for the law, for the permit on the toxic chemicals is specified in the law on chemical safety, which is already in force from the end of June 2024. The categories of substances that are classified as toxic are in Ukraine Reach, that is not yet in force and enters into force on the 26th of January 2025. So what does it mean in practice? So the worst case is that the companies who are placing on the market toxic substances already are supposed to have a permit. A bit better case if the permit is required when Ukraine Reach enters into force, because the categories of toxic substances are specified in the Ukraine Reach regulation. And of course, the best case if there is this 12-month transitional period that is applicable for chemical products placed on Ukrainian market before Ukraine Reach enactment, so that you would have the 12 months to submit the permit. So the exact time when the permit is required is something that has to be confirmed from the competent authority. And at the moment, at least for us, it's not yet clear. So to be determined. And the law on chemical safety is a little bit vague on who can apply for the permit. So if you look at the one set of articles that only representative can apply for the toxic chemicals permit on behalf of the non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator. But if you look at the toxic chemicals permit specific articles, it states that you can only apply for your specific use, and only representative obviously doesn't use the chemical, or if it represents the non-Ukrainian manufacturer who manufactures the substance outside of Ukraine. So it is unclear whether only representative can apply for the permit or not, and it's yet to be determined by the competent authority. Next slide, please. So for the permit application, the requirements are in the law on chemical safety, and we have listed them here for you. So you have to submit certain substance information, UPAC name, cast trade name, molecular weight, impurities, additives. Then you need to provide information on the uses of the substance, so basically the uses that you're applying the permit for. You need to apply the chemical safety report. It has to be annexed to the application if applicable. And then you need to provide the details on implemented risk management measures for safe use. And something interesting is that you need to also explain what kind of liability insurance you have for coverage of potential harm to the environment and or life, health, or property of third parties from use of these hazardous chemicals. So this requirement, how it's going to be applied in practice, is also yet to be determined. And then you provide details on fee calculation and payment confirmation. And what it means in practice is that you explain what kind of fee would be applicable to your application. You calculate based on your company size, on the amount of substances you're applying permit for, their uses, and this is calculated based on Ukraine has a bit different system. So in brief, there is a subsistence minimum that is annually established in Ukraine, and then you multiply the subsistence minimum with the applicable coefficients from the law on chemical safety. So all this information, the calculation of the fee for the permit of toxic chemicals, registration fee, permit for the authorization. So this is all in the law on chemical safety and can be calculated. If you have questions on this, please contact me separately on this matter. Next slide, please. So for the authorization and restriction, this will be very brief information on this requirements. So EU REACH Annex 14 has been basically translated in Ukrainian language and added as Ukraine REACH Annex 14 on authorization. And it has currently the same amount of entries, so 59 entries, but of course the difference is in the latest application date, which is 1st of April 2027, and the sunset date is 1st of June 2027, so they are only two months apart. And you need to obtain a permit for substances that are on the authorization list. And this is exactly the same logic as with the toxic chemical substances permit. It's not in the Ukraine REACH in terms of requirements, but it's in the law on chemical safety. Again, another layer of interconnectivity between the law on chemical safety and the Ukraine REACH. So the requirements for the permit for the authorization application, or if we speak in the Ukrainian REACH and law on chemical safety terms, permit for use of substances placed on the authorization list, are in Article 47.10 of the law on chemical safety. So not in the Ukraine REACH, but in the law on chemical safety. And generally they are the same as in the EU REACH. However, we have this additional layer of liability insurance, so exactly the same requirement as was for the toxic substances. So how will this be applied in practice? Again, we will see in the future. And in Ukraine, the authorization application has to be reviewed by the competent authority in only 30 days. And it's either granted or rejected, and the maximum validity is 5 years. So in your authorization application, you will have to specify, are you applying for 1 year, 2, 3, or 4? And your fee for the authorization will also depend on the duration of the permit required. Next slide, please. So for restriction, Annex 17 has been translated into Ukrainian and became Ukraine REACH Annex 17. We believe that this is the version from 2023. So therefore, you can check. You can of course use the Google Translate or similar translation services, but essentially the idea was to translate the requirements of the Annex 17. However, there could be some deviations in terms of translation. Therefore, if you have spotted something, please let the competent authority know. Next slide, please. So now that we have discussed the main implications for the industry, we are basically left with the requirement of the safety data sheets. And safety data sheets requirements are basically the same as they are under the EU REACH. So for those who know safety data sheets under the EU REACH, they know them under the Ukraine REACH as well. So we have a requirement of format, specific format of the safety data sheet according to the Ukraine REACH Annex 2, and this is the same annex as in the EU REACH. We have the structure of 16 sections and the exposure scenarios, and in Ukrainian the safety data sheet is the passport bezpečnosti, but we have the same amount of sections and the same structure. And it has to be in the Ukrainian language. So we have received quite many questions previously that whether it can be in English language. No, it has to be in Ukrainian language, and it's written clearly in the Ukraine REACH as a separate article. However, you have the transitional period of 12 months in the same way as for other requirements under the Ukraine REACH if you have been placing certain chemical substances or mixtures on the Ukrainian market before enactment of the Ukraine REACH regulation. So for chemicals placed on the market for the first time after entry into force of Ukraine REACH, the compliance starts from the enactment date of the Ukraine REACH, so from 26th of January 2025. But for chemicals that have been already on the market before the entry into force date of the Ukraine REACH, the compliance with the safety data sheet requirements is mandatory from the January 26th, 2026. So please take this into account. Next slide, please. So now that we talked through the main implications and key responsibilities depending on the role in the supply chain, I would briefly talk through the main takeaways of this presentation, and then we will move to the Q&A session. So Ukraine REACH is going to enter into force on the 26th of January 2025, and at the moment, there is no indication for any postponement. Ukraine REACH shall be treated and interpreted together with the law on chemical safety and other applicable, for example, secondary legislation, different orders on toxic chemicals, permit, authorization, etc., etc. So don't read the Ukraine REACH in isolation. So please take into account especially law on chemical safety and, of course, Ukraine CLP. Even though Ukraine REACH is very much aligned with the EU REACH in terms of general framework, however, there are key differences. For example, the permit for the toxic chemicals, even though yes, it's required under law on chemical safety, but in fact, the categories of toxic chemicals are in the Ukraine REACH text. And we have the simplified registration, which is yet to be confirmed in whether it will be applicable and in which format. And then maybe the main takeaway of this presentation is to focus on the pre-registration. So it's quite clear the Ukraine REACH will be entering into force, and pre-registration is a prerequisite to benefit from the transitional registration deadline. Therefore, it's good to focus for the industry on the pre-registration and think about how you're going to submit it through your subsidiary in Ukraine, through the only representative, through your customers, or I mean, what are your options? And we have provided 4 of them for you if you're a non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator in this presentation. Next slide, please. And in addition to the main takeaways, there are pending uncertainties. So we all know, and it's quite clear that the competent authority is very busy They have a massive chemicals law implementation, so I mean the law on chemical safety and horizontal technical regulations such as Ukraine REACH and many different secondary legislative acts that they need to implement, and they have a very short time frame to do so. However, what we expect from them is to somehow prioritize the guidance for so-called immediate compliance. So, for example, we know that the pre-registration is required very soon, so it would be good to understand that the template and how it's going to be submitted. The toxic chemicals permit, it's unclear whether we need it already now or from the enactment of the Ukraine REACH or when. So it would be good to have the clarifications on those obligations that have either the shortest deadline or no transitional deadline at all. Then it would be good to understand the IT system. We know that the Euclid is planned, but would be good to know a bit more details when, and would it be in English or Ukrainian, and what kind of IT system will be used by the Ministry of Environment in the future. And especially this is relevant for the first registration deadline on the 1st of October 2026, because essentially this is the most sensitive deadline, because there is not enough time from the registration deadline to complete the registration for the high volume substances for the first deadline. And we need some decisions on the simplified registration. The competent authority is aware of this problem, so hopefully they will provide the guidance to the industry soon after the implementation of the Ukraine REACH, so sometimes in winter 2025, so that the industry can start preparation either for simplified registration or for the regular registration. A simplified registration process won't be applicable in Ukraine. So this is something that, of course, we are waiting, and these are the main uncertainties at the moment. Next slide, please. So we are following at REACHLaw the development of Ukraine REACH and related legislation. Maybe something I haven't mentioned. I'm the Ukrainian native speaker, so I actually read everything in the language, in the native language. So if you have any questions on that, please also feel free to contact me. So if there is any new information on what we have provided here or anything completely new, we will be happy to provide further guidance for you. Next slide, please. So you can see my contact details on the next slide. Please contact me if you have any questions after this webinar. And I think now we are going to the Q&A session. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Alessia, for those insights today. That was great. I think there's so much in there that was really useful for everyone listening. Now we have time for a couple of questions. So if you haven't already done so, please enter those into the questions box. We're not going to have time to get to everyone's questions, but Alessia has kindly agreed that the questions that don't get answered are going to be answered in writing afterwards, and we're going to send those out to everyone. So while we go through those questions, we're just going to go through a few slides for you to look at, including some information about some of our upcoming events. Okay, so Alessia, can a non-Ukrainian formulator appoint an only representative to handle pre-registrations under Ukraine REACH?
Yes, it's a very good question. So it's in the same way applicable as it was under the EU REACH. So non-Ukrainian manufacturer and non-Ukrainian formulator can appoint an only representative to take care of the compliance issues under the Ukraine REACH.
Okay, great. The next question is, can EU manufacturers apply for simplified registration directly without an only representative?
Well, the bigger question here is whether there will be a simplified registration and what form. So, but even if it will be a simplified registration and the format would be and scope would be somehow better defined, the non-Ukrainian manufacturers are not actors under Ukrainian law, so they are located outside of Ukraine, so it won't be possible. They would need an only representative in Ukraine, so a local legal entity to apply for the simplified registration in the same way as just a regular registration. So the local entity, local presence is needed.
Right, okay. Um, interesting question here. What will happen to Ukraine Reach once Ukraine joins the EU?
Well, this is a very good question, and I don't think there is an answer to this question at this stage. But the idea, I mean, if Ukraine becomes a member state, so basically there won't be a Ukraine reach, so there will be a EU reach where Ukraine is a member state, and how the transition from Ukraine reach registrations, for example, would go to EU reach registrations. This is a good question, and this has been raised actually many times, and the companies are a bit worried. For example, okay, they register under the Ukraine reach, and in the next few years, Ukraine becomes a member. So it means that they have paid for the data twice. So they bought the data for the EU reach, registered, and then they bought the data to register for Ukraine reach. And in the end, it will be one joint submission. So this is like a concern for the industry, and also as far as we understand, the ministry at the moment, the competent authority in Ukraine understands it too. This is why the simplified registration in its current format probably is not a very good idea. So maybe considering these concerns from the industry and the implications when hopefully Ukraine becomes part of the EU, they should be taken into account to have a bit better and more efficient process for the simplified registration.
Okay, interesting. The next question is, could you clarify the SDS transitional provisions under the Ukraine Reach?
So we have covered here on this in this presentation about this, but yes, indeed, it's good to emphasize it again. So if you have been placing chemical products on the market before Ukraine Reach entered into force, you have 12 months transitional period to prepare your safety data sheets according to the Ukraine Reach requirements. If you are placing your chemicals for the first time on the Ukrainian market after the enactment of the Ukraine Reach, then you need to have the safety data sheet before you place these chemicals on the market.
There's a few questions about translation. People want to know, is it possible to submit some registration information in English to minimize the translation efforts?
Well, at the moment, there are no guidances for the Ukraine REACH registration. So what we could only conclude is the text of the regulation, and in the text of the regulation, there is no such possibility. So likely, and as far as we understood from the discussions among the industry, Ukrainian industry and the authority, everything will be in Ukrainian. It might be that something for the lead registration, maybe certain studies will be allowed in English, but this will be something that is going to be specified later on. So at the moment, the industry should prepare that everything will have to be in Ukrainian.
Okay, good to know. There's another question. Can we expect any postponements of registration deadlines under Ukraine Reach?
This is a good question. We don't know the answer to this question, and I don't think that even competent authorities know the answer to this question. So it really depends very much on the readiness of, for example, Euclid. So can they use Euclid? What kind of ID system they will have? And what kind of registration there will be. So if there will be a process for a simplified registration, maybe then postponement is not needed. But if there won't be any simplified registration, maybe the registration deadlines will be postponed. But it's important to know that the pre-registration will not likely be postponed. So likely the pre-registration, you will have this 1 year, so please use it wisely to benefit from any transitional registration deadlines. Because if you don't use the pre-registration deadline, you will not be able to benefit from the transitional registration deadlines, whether they are postponed or not. So maybe important to focus on the pre-registration. It's our best advice at the moment.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Lesia. Sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but Alessia is going to get back to those questions after the session. So yeah, thank you once again, and thank you everyone for listening. We hope you found this valuable. You'll receive the feedback and the recording by email in the next few days. And it's also going to be up on the REACHLaw YouTube channel. So yeah, please do look out for that feedback survey, which is going to be in your inbox shortly. Yeah, but thank you again for everyone involved, and we look forward to welcoming you back to another Chemical Watch events and training event soon. So have a good rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.